Hi everyone, it's Karen at Close to My Heart. Today we're going to be learning some fun watercolor techniques. So let's start by looking at the gorgeous art, and then I'll teach you how to get the looks that we've done in this art. On this piece right here, you can see there's some really great watercolor going on in the background. We're going to be learning how to do that. I'm going to lift it up just a little bit here so you can see that a little bit closer. You can see that there's kind of some little dots and some streaks, and we're going to learn how to do that smushing technique with watercolor paints. We're also going to be learning how to get this look right here, this really great background that we did through a stencil with watercolor paints. We're also going to be learning, like you can see on this card here, this really great stamping with watercolors. And let's go back to that last card that I just showed you, because we're going to be learning some basic painting techniques as well. So we're going to learn some basics and some more advanced techniques today that we've used on this art. So let's get started. We're going to start with our watercolor paint set. We'll need that. We also here at Close to My Heart carry two different sizes of round water brushes. One is the medium round and one is the small round. And I'm just going to pull these out and tell you the differences. The difference is just the size of the tip of the brush. You can see that the small round, hopefully, maybe if I hold my hand under it for you, is a little bit shorter and finer, and the medium round's a little longer and wider. And depending on what you're using, a larger area to paint with, or like the smushing technique we're going to be doing, you might want to use the medium water brush. Whereas if you're doing more detailed painting or painting through the stencil that we're going to use, you'll want the more fine brush. Let's get these out of the way. When you receive your water brush, as you could see, there's a lid on there. You just pull that lid off. You also need to fill your brush with water. And it unscrews. You just pull off the top and then fill it with water. Now obviously this would be much easier for you at your sink, so bear with me as I do my best to pour this in so you can see without making a large mess. Okay, and once you get that near the top, you just screw that back in. I might be pushing my luck. That first one went great. Now I need to fill the second one. All right, here we go. We'll just pour water in. And we'll fill that near to the top. There we go. We've got both of our brushes filled. We'll move that out of the way. And a few of these other things out of the way. And I'm going to bring in some blank cardstock. And I'm going to show you the difference in the tips. Now, when you use them with your paints, one thing that I love about the paints that we sell is that they have these little troughs over here, and that can become your paint palette. How's that? So you can mix colors over there, mix water with your paint. I'm going to use the medium water brush right now, and I'm just going to add a little bit of water to one of these little troughs and then pick up some paint. And oh, by the way, I probably should tell you, the way that I got that water, you just squeeze it just slightly, and that water makes its way into the brush. Now you can see here that I've got a really nice puddle of water and paint, and I actually want just a tiny bit more paint in there. So I'm gonna just come over here and add a little more. Now watch as I add that to my piece of cardstock. I'm taking this medium round water brush and just making a stripe of that color. I probably should have done a darker color. I'll do a darker color to kind of give you a little bit better view. So let's do the same thing here with this darker purple color. I think that will show up a lot better. Okay, I've got some kind of magenta paint here, and I'm using my medium water brush, and I'm adding a stripe. And you can kind of see about how long that paintbrush is and what I can do with it. Now let's do the same thing with the small, and I'll use a different color this time. Let's go with maybe this royal blue color. Just squeezing a little bit of water into there, picking up some paint and mixing it. And then you'll be able to see the difference in the size of these two brushes. The smaller one obviously makes a much smaller trail. There you go. Okay, so that tells you a little bit about both of our water brushes. And now I'm going to teach you a couple of techniques. Let's start with the smushing technique that you saw on that beautiful 8.5 by 11 page. To get that look, we're using the all-purpose mat here. I'm going to move this paper out of the way. And we're going to create kind of a paint design here on our mat. And I'm going to use my medium water brush for this technique. I'm just using my stamp chamois to clean my brush off, get the color off the brush. Now I'm going to start and go light to darkest just because that way I don't have to clean my brush in between, and I'm going to pull this in hopefully so you can see a little bit of what I'm doing. This is going to be fun to fit everything on the camera. Here we go. Let's start with this lighter pink, and we'll just paint a little area here with this paint, and we're going to get kind of aggressive and put a whole bunch on here. Can you see that I'm just putting that right on my all-purpose mat, and it's beating up a little bit, but that's fine. Okay, now I'm going to move to this more magenta color, and I'm going to add that, some of that to here. I'm even going to let them overlap just a little bit. Then I'm going to move to this brighter blue color and add a stripe of that below. I'm even going to like put a few little dots of that here and there. You can play and get all kinds of looks. So you can see I just took my royal blue and mixed it in with that magenta, and I've even got a little bit different color right there. Okay, now that I've got that on my mat, I'm going to take my cardstock and I'm going to lay it face down into that design I've just created and push with my fingers. And I'm even going to take my cardstock and move it up and down and side to side a little bit as I'm pushing so that it sort of all blends together. And you can see I've got a really cool design there. The more paint you put on there, the more you're going to see blending, the less you'll get more of a splotchy look like this. And let me show you, if I were to have just laid my paper into the paint without rubbing at all, I would have gotten a look more like this. Whereas when I rub and add a little more paint, you can see that it blends together nicely. Now let's pull that piece of art in again. Let me wipe up my mat here so that I don't get that on my art. We'll pull that piece of art back in, and you can see how we've used that technique on this art to really get a really gorgeous splotchy technique. Down here we painted more in a circle instead of a line. These are more like lines. And then here is where we kind of just pushed and didn't smudge too much, more like they're little dots. So you can play with all kinds of looks on your all-purpose mat to get this look that we have on this particular layout. Now let's move on to the next technique I want to show you. And that one is what we saw here on this card, where we actually used a stencil. Now you can tell, if I pull this up a little closer for you, that this is not a perfect stencil look. If you want a perfect look, you'll probably want to sponge through your stencil. But if you want a more messy, organic look like what we've created on this card, you can use watercolors with a stencil. So we've just used our stencil paper and a background that we found, I think, on Art Booking, one of our Cricut collections. And I'm going to show you the tricks to know about painting through a stencil. Now, one thing to remember is when painting through a stencil, you don't want a ton of water. So let's use our medium brush again. I'm going to wipe this off as best as I can so that I can use a different color and show you a whole different look. Again, just using my stamp chamois. And let's go back and choose a color. Let's mix a color this time so you can kind of see that idea. So let's mix an orange and a pink together to kind of get this more salmon-y color that you see on this card. So we'll start with this with a little bit of water here. We'll pick up this lighter orange color. Let's add that. And we only put a tiny bit of water. Now I'm going to go back over and pick up some of this pink and add it to the orange, and maybe even some of this brighter orange. And so that I've created kind of a, I don't know, a coral color. Here at Close to My Heart, we probably would call it smoothie. That's the color that our cardstock is that's similar to that. And we have matching ink to that too. Okay, so I'm gonna lay this on my card. Now, if you have too much water, it's going to bleed under your stencil. So there's a few things to remember. You want to keep going the same direction. So I'm just gonna kind of lightly start to paint on my stencil. You want to hold your stencil tight to your paper to help keep it from bleeding. And you want to make sure when you lift your stencil up that you lift it straight up and don't slide it, because that will also move what you've painted. And you can see that fun, messy stencil look that I've got here. Another fun thing to do after you've got that done with the messy look is to take that same paint on your brush, tap your finger, and you can get some really great splatters. Let's see if I can do those enough so you can see onto your card. And I'll lift that up for you so you can kind of see what that looks like. Okay, so that is the technique we used here on the background of this card. And now let's talk about painting these leaves and how to do that. Now that's a pretty tight space, so we're going to use our small round water brush. So let's pull that one back in, and that one I used in that blue, so I'm gonna clean that up for you. And I'm going to pull in the stamped plant that we've used here and this pot that we stamped onto a piece of our pattern paper. And I'm going to show you a few fun things with that. Let's start with the pot, because I'm going to use that same color that I just used for my background, only I'm going to add a tiny bit more water to it. And I'm just going to, and I love the all-purpose mat because I can kind of wipe off my extra there. And all I'm going to do is take my paint and just on the side of that little pot, add a little bit of shading. Isn't that a fun way to add just a tiny bit of personality to a piece that may be stamped on colored or patterned paper, and you can see just a little bit of shading? That's another great way to use watercolors on top of colored paper or patterned paper. Now let's go to painting these plants. I'm going to use a few different greens, so let me turn my paints around so that might be on screen for you. And we'll start with the lightest green. So I'm going to start with this kind of lime green and make myself a palette. Now, one thing to remember when you're painting something like this is less is more. And so I like to start out with quite a small amount of paint. And this time I'm using a little more water than we used before. And I'm going to start by painting this leaf all in this lighter color. You can see I'm just kind of painting like we did when we were little kids, right? In first and second grade, I can remember doing this in school. Okay, now that I've gotten that one painted, and also you can see with the water, you can move it around just a little bit. So if I want more color in the middle, I'll just move it back over there. Okay, now that I've gotten that part of the green on there, I'm going to pick another green. Let's go with this kind of deep teal green, and we'll create our little palette with that. I'm going to wipe off my extra, and now I'm just going to take it and go down the middle of this plant and then work out a little bit. And it's a little darker than I want, so I can go back in, add a little more water, and pull it. Can you see how that's moving and giving me kind of a nice shaded look on this leaf? And I will, once I get this done, I will pick it up for you to see. I'm actually going out of the lines just a little bit because I like that messy look, but if you don't, then you should stay in the lines, right? Okay, now I'm going to add a little more color right down the center. So I'm going to go back in and I'm going to pick up this deep green. You can see how you can be so detailed with these paints. And wipe off the extra. I think the key thing to remember is less is more, because you can always go add more. It's harder to take it away, although I will show you this. If you get a little more than you want on something, you can just take like a tissue and blot it just a little bit like this. And it will pick up some of that color. You can see how I just lightened it and it even blended nicer. Now you'll notice on this card, I think we use different greens on this card, but you can see how we've gotten quite a bit darker there compared to here. And I think I could get this look if I just did a little less water. So it depends on which look you're looking for, a thicker look or this lighter, thinner look like I've created here today. You can do any kinds of looks with these paints. One tip I will give you when you're painting a stamped image, I try really hard not to do a thick image like this on lines, because it kind of, if it's a thicker amount of paint with less water, it'll start to cover up the line on your stamp if you're not careful, and then you don't see those outlines. Okay, so now you've seen a little bit about painting, and if I had a much larger image, then I probably would use the medium water brush on that one. Now let's do one more fun technique. Let's bring this last card in that I showed you. You can see on this card, we've done some stamping, and don't those look really soft and blurry, those leaves? We stamped these flowers and these leaves and the sentiment with a stamp pad, an ink pad, and the stamps that you saw right here. This stamp set called Simple Florals. But the leaves that we have here across the bottom, we've actually painted our stamp and stamped with it, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So let's put this card right here and pull out our stamp. So as you may or may not know, our stamps are acrylic stamps, and they just pull right off this carrier sheet. You can add them to one of our acrylic blocks that is close to size of the stamp. You'll want to season your stamp, especially when it's brand new, and I just do that by rubbing it right on the back of my hand. And then it's ready to stamp. And when you're done, you just clean it with that stamp chamois you've seen me using. I've just run this under water, and you just clean it right off and put it away back on the carrier sheet. Now, let's do a little bit of stamping with this. Now, as you can see on this card, we stamped a little bit off the edges, and we let it be a little bit blurry. And that's what's going to happen just because you are using paints. Now, one thing to remember is that you don't want to use a ton of water when you stamp with them on stamps, or it will run. And you want to be careful to stay on the raised or the stamp part of the image, not of any of the background stuff that's down below. So I'm going to go back to my water and paint. And like I said, I'm using very little water, and I'm just going to paint my stamp, and I'm going to do my best to stay right on top of the raised part, or the part of the stamp that actually stamps, and not get down on those in between them, because that, especially if there's too much water, that will start to run down in, and then when you stamp it, it makes a mess. And I'm going to show you some good examples and bad examples in just a second, so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, I've got my stamp painted. I'm going to add just a little bit more so it's nice and wet, but not too much water, mostly wet with paint. And then take this and stamp it on my cardstock. And you'll be able to see that we're going to get that cool, soft, blurry, organic, not perfect look. And I love that look. Now let's look at a couple of examples that I did for you so you can see. This one, way too much water. Can you see how it bled down in between? In fact, it bled down in between, and that's the part that was the darkest. The second one still had too much water. It still started to bleed. So make sure that you practice this a little bit before you put it on the actual art. This one was just right, and it was more like what I just showed you. Less water, more paint. So there you have it. When you're done with your painting, I always just take like a wet paper towel. You could use your stamp chamois again if you want, and just wipe out this area that I've used to create my palette so that it's clean and ready for the next time I'm ready to paint and make more beautiful watercolored art. I hope you've enjoyed your time with me today and learned something fun and new.